Hello, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the War of Ideas. I'm your host, John Parker. We are here in the Pangburn universe of intellectual content, and today we have another very exciting interview. We have a political philosopher hailing from some of the most prestigious universities in America, who is here to talk to us a little bit about communitarianism, about just war, about terror, and about very many other interesting things that he is an expert in. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to our distinguished guest, Professor Michael Walzer. How you doing, Professor?
I'm doing pretty well.
Thanks for coming and agreeing to talk to me. Um, I guess the first question before we, get into the ideas, I always like to get to know the person a little bit. I'm curious, how did you get into the field that you got into? How did you get into political philosophy, and then what made you decide to go into academia instead of, being a lawyer or something?
Um, because I was interested in politics. I
Hmm.
wanted to write about politics. I wanted to write about politics in political magazines, not just in academic journals. Um, I wanted to have space for political activity. And the academic world seemed a lot more open than any other part of the American economy.
Sure, but you wanted to get involved in political thought as opposed to politics proper. Why is that? Because many people just go into politics or work on campaigns. Why didn't you?
I actually worked in
Ah,
political
I see.
and social movements. I wasn't
Mhm.
interested in campaigns, but I was active in the civil rights movement and I was active in the anti war movement in the late 60s. And
Mhm.
then I edited a political magazine for many, many years. And all this was possible because I was a professor, a professor on the side, as it were.
Right. Where did you start out teaching? I know that you ended up, in some of the best universities in the world, but is that where you started?
I was a graduate student at Harvard
Mm.
after undergraduate of 4 years at Brandeis University,
Oh, cool.
and I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I did some teaching there before I moved to Princeton for 4 years, and then back to Harvard,
Mm.
where I taught for I don't know about 20 years.
Seems like you were really roughing it, bouncing back and forth between Princeton and Harvard. Yeah. Okay. Well, that is certainly very interesting. So one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about is the thing that jumped out at me when I first started researching you, which is this idea of communitarianism. Now, I have also been educated in political philosophy, not to the same extent as you. I'm very sure, but I know a lot of isms, and I have never heard of communitarianism before I looked into it. So I'm curious. Could you tell me a little bit about what that is? And if you would consider yourself a member of that ideology, and take it away.
I'm not a member. I am a very highly qualified communitarian. I'm
Mm,
probably best described as an old social democrat, but
mm,
um, communitarianism arose as a response to the radical individualism of most um, liberal philosophers who seem to focus on the the unattached individual alone in the world, and who imagined liberal society as a collection of those kinds of individuals reaching contractual agreements.
mm.
And the critique of this by Michael Sandel was the first one to write a
Right.
really strong response to Rawls and other academic philosophers. The critique was that that's not real life. That's not the way people are. People are attached. They come into the world in families, and the families are members of religious and ethnic groups. and these memberships are enormously important in the lives of all the people we know. And it was time for philosophers to begin to address these real life engagements and to puzzle about what makes a good relationship, what makes a good community, what kinds of effective ties hold people together. Because it's what kinds of effective ties lead young men and women to be ready to fight to defend their country.
Right.
A liberal contract just doesn't seem to do it.
And I think modern history has bared that out to a large extent. So I actually agree with this. I agree with this quite a bit. I've always, or more recently, as I've become more of a thinking person, subscribed to the idea that the fundamental political unit is the little platoon of the family more than the atomistic individual. But I guess, but I'm sure that you would agree that recognition for the sovereignty of the individual is important, which leads to the pretty obvious question: is how does communitarianism actually manifest in terms of policy? And I know it can be a couple different ways, and it's almost an unfair question, but I am asking it anyway. Is what, so like this all sounds very nice, but you can make any ideology sound nice in the abstract. I'm curious, what would this potentially look like in the ideal version?
Well, just as there are a range of communitarian views, there are a range of liberal views, beginning with libertarianism on the far right
Hmm.
and extending to American New Deal liberalism, which was the American version of social democracy.
Hmm.
I am a liberal communitarian and also a social democrat. Um, I think that communitarian policies, um, well, imagine a strong welfare state. Um, Imagine a genuinely socialized medical system
Mm.
where everyone is cared for, um, and where the bureaucracy is limited by significant local participation in all of the organizations of the welfare state. Something like that is what the communitarians were arguing for. They were probably also they would be strongly in support of a core curriculum, so that we create a national community of people who can speak to one another, who have common reference points. Um, well, uh, I,
Well, yeah, yeah. So I suppose, how do I formulate this correctly? Um, I suppose that in your description of how the policies actually look, it looks kind of more like the modern left wing. Although, let me pose an idea to you, and I don't know if you'll agree with it, but I'm just curious how you respond. Is I see now, ironically enough, more radical individualism coming from the at least socially left side of the aisle about absolute autonomy and things of that notion. While I see certain sections of the right wing become a lot more focused on things like family and community and shared institutions like church, and things like that. I'm curious, does that figure into communitarianism at all, or do you think that it's really about like the national level, like as you say, socialized medicine and stuff like that, that really makes or breaks a communitarian?
no, I've actually there are two versions of communitarianism. One of them is localist in character and
Mm.
imagines a liberal society like the United States as being a host to many different communities. So
I sign up for that. I
the
think I agree with that.
experience of communal warmth might come in the academic world, it might come in the Jewish world for me. It might come in the living in New York, being a New Yorker. Um, and then the national communitarians do tend sometimes to be very right wing, to demand, to look for homogeneity, to dislike immigration,
Right.
um, to want a kind of patriotism that is unquestioning,
Mm,
um, uncritical. Uh, yes, so there is a right wing
sure.
communitarianism, definitely, and we are seeing it today in some parts of the Republican Party.
Yeah. I got to tell you, communitarianism sounds an awful lot like populism. I have to say, the fact that it can apply to the left or the right, it can manifest in many different forms. Would you say that that's a fair comparison, or if they're not similar, how would you say that they're different?
Well, populism is an appeal to the people, um,
Well, a
conceived,
certain
conceived
the people is
as a coherent entity.
the
Um,
real people. Let's say
the real people, yeah,
the real people. Yeah,
yes,
whatever
and
that.
you get charismatic politicians who claim to embody and to speak for the people,
Mhm.
and to want to exclude all outsiders, all people who don't fit into the definition of the people. So there is that kind of populism. There is also a left wing populism, which is much more like socialism.
Yeah. The left and right examples of populism that are usually cited is Donald Trump on one side and Bernie Sanders on the other is the prototypical examples. Um, although populism seems to be more of, as you say, like an appeal more than like a policy set, which is always interesting. Yeah,
Well, it does tend to produce policies like um, tendencies toward authoritarianism, toward anti-immigrant. It does, yeah. There are policies that go with populist politicians like Orban in Hungary.
sure,
Um,
sure. What do you think of Orban, by the way? Because I know he does some bad stuff, and I'm not saying that, but I will say that the one good thing I heard from him is no income tax once you have a certain amount of kids. I feel like the West could take a lesson from that. So I'm curious your thoughts on that policy, and then thoughts on Orban in general.
you really are a natalist. You think
I
the
kids are good. Yeah.
in the world today is that we don't have enough people here.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that one, children are wonderful and are a blessing of unto themselves, and I can just put that as a posit. But then you can also say there's lots of smart people who argue that pretty soon we're going to have an underpopulation problem, the way that figures trend. And then the third argument, which I think is the most interesting argument, is even if we felt like we were having too many people, occasionally you get lucky and you get one of those kids to be a genius who can massively make us more efficient with our resources. So it's kind of worth it. So I guess that'd be my three pronged defense. Also,
Yes,
babies are cute. That's
I
point number four.
I do like children, and
Yeah.
I have been a critic of the American left,
Mm.
um, arguing that it has a serious policy problem of physical reproduction. There,
Yeah. And you see that in so many different ways. I mean, the climate stuff, which there's real problems to be looked at, but there's like serious antinatalism behind climate concerns, and that's been true ever since the population bomb, which was wrong, by the way, as I'm sure you know. And then we have like something like we have millions of abortions a year, which regardless of how one feels about abortion, is not exactly pro-child. And they're filling in the stopgap with very permissive immigration laws to like make up for the difference in birth rates. So I would totally agree. The American left doesn't super love old fashioned baby making. Let's say, um, one can only imagine why. Although, actually, I'll ask you, why do you think that is? You're the political philosopher here. Do you have any hunches?
no, it is a significant problem. I wrote a book about the cultural reproduction
Mm,
of the political left, and I when I was traveling around and talking about the book, sometimes somebody would stand up in the audience and tell me that what I should really worry about is not the cultural reproduction, but the physical reproduction of the secular left. And they are they're right. Um,
Yeah. I wonder if there's even a difference. This is kind of my thought because I'm a little bit old fashioned. I'm a pretty big fan of Western civilization, and the declining birth rates all across Western civilization make that line between physical reproduction and ideological reproduction almost stop mattering. I guess that's prong number four, which is if people who are part of our civilization don't have enough children, then eventually our civilization is going to die out, and that would be a negative thing. Do you see that risk, or do you think I'm being a little bit dramatic?
you could read all about it in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's um, political theory, because he thought that a low birth rate was the sign of of a decadent culture.
Well, so you're telling me I'm late to the party. That's what I'm hearing right now. Yeah, interesting stuff. But yeah, I'm very much pro child. I agree. Look at that, we're on a tangent already. Um, I think I got a handle on communitarianism. I do. I think we need more of it. Again, I find that socially, at least, we have radical individualism. We want to be liberated from everything, from social norms to even in some from like cultural expectations, even all the way down to biology in some cases. So I think a rising communitarianism would be good. I guess I would subscribe to the localist communitarianism. I think that sounds pretty decent, although perhaps it's utopian, but that's what federalism was supposed to be. But I think I got a handle on it. You're pretty good at this. Who would have thought? But I am curious about just war. I think this is going to be the most controversial part of our talk. Just war theory. I know what it is, but not everybody knows what it is. So could you explain what is just war theory? What makes a war just or unjust? And where does that idea kind of come from?
Well, there has never been a political leader who could send young men and now women into battle to kill and be killed without giving them a reason,
Sure.
without telling them that what they're doing is the right thing to do. So in every civilization and in every religion, there are criteria for going to war and criteria for fighting a war.
Hmm.
In my case, I grew up a Jewish kid in New York during World War II. That
Ooh.
was that was an immunization against pacifism. I have never doubted that the war against the Nazis was just and necessary. And if that's true, then the category exists. There are just and necessary wars, and that one won't be, wouldn't be, couldn't be the only one. Um, so for me, I have always had that one abiding belief that there are some wars that need to be fought. Um, I wrote a book called Just and Unjust Wars, which is among my books the bestseller.
Oh, congratulations.
It was adopted as a required text at West Point, so
Oh, really?
I have visited West Point often.
I have family who've graduated from West Point. That's interesting. Maybe they read you. I'll have to look into it.
So, and I started. It all began for me in 1967. I was a young lefty running around the country giving speeches against Vietnam, against the war in Vietnam. And then suddenly I was also giving speeches defending Israel's preemptive attack on Egypt And people thought maybe that's inconsistent, and so I had to argue there are just and unjust wars, and we need to think about how to distinguish them. And it took me 10 years to write a book that tries to make those distinctions. Um,
Well, I think you know the next question. What are those distinctions? What's the criteria? What are the boxes to check in your
well,
view?
first of all, you can look at the domestic analogy, which is quite simple. If I am mugged on the street, attacked on the street, and I defend myself, that is a miniature version of a just war.
Mm.
And if you, seeing me attacked, come to my aid, that's also a miniature version of a just war. So raise that to the level of states. Um, when one state is attacked, we call it aggression. When there is an act of aggression against the state, like Ukraine, um, the defense of the country is justified, and
Mhm.
the aggressor is fighting an unjust war.
Is it always so easy to tell who the aggressor is? Because that's the trick, right? Because I mean, Putin claimed that the aggressor was actually, NATO bloc when they did a coup of a Russia-friendly leader in 2014.
Right.
And we were talking to Cenk Uygur on the other show like 2 weeks ago, and he would claim that Israel's been the aggressor the whole time because they've been in an open air prison. The Israelis would claim it's for security because they get suicide bombed, and the Palestinians would argue that they stole their land. So I
Right.
suppose, when does history stop, right? Because every inch of land is soaked in blood. There's no land on earth that was not stolen by somebody from somebody else. So I guess, when do we decide when we can start counting who's aggressing and who's not?
No, look,
Easy questions like that, I expect for you to have a definitive answer.
just war theory is an invitation to argument. It is a way of structuring the arguments that we have. Um,
Mm,
you can explain what aggression is, and I can explain why Putin's war is a war of aggression. I don't expect everyone to jump up and shout their agreement. These are things we argue about, and
mm.
the arguments go on forever. But there are better and worse arguments. That's what keeps us going. The belief that there is a better argument, and that eventually enough people will be convinced.
Well, I certainly hope so. Um, I mean, do you have a particular opinion on the Russia Ukraine? You believe that Putin was definitely the aggressor there? Um,
Yes, I do believe that. I believe um, I, that NATO's expansion was not driven by imperial ambition. It wasn't a push, it was more a pull. The
mm,
countries of Eastern Europe, having endured Russian authoritarian rule for many years, wanted NATO,
mm.
wanted the mutual support that NATO provides. Um, that was
No,
not that was they were not acting to destroy or attack Russia. They were acting to save themselves from any form of Russian aggression.
well, I certainly wouldn't color myself a Russophile, but I am going to push back on you a little bit because it's fun. Which is, does it matter what the motivation was? Like, whether or not NATO's intents were imperialistic or not, do you think it's unreasonable for Russia to consider being surrounded by NATO armaments completely you know a unacceptable security threat? Like, even if NATO's motives really was like flowers and daisies, like, I don't know, if I was running the country, I wouldn't want the organization that was formed to oppose me to surround me on all sides.
In fact, there were many, many, many Russians who were quite happy to
Really, that's
um,
interesting.
to live with NATO and even to join it.
Right, but then NATO said no. So that doesn't exactly make one somebody rest easy.
I didn't exactly say no. Um, that was a
Hmm.
possible negotiation. That was a I mean, after all, every country that has joined NATO has gone through a period of consideration and initiation. And there are things they have to agree to and comply with before they can join. Um, but look, the central idea that is in Putin's mind
Yeah.
is that a great power like Russia is entitled to have a sphere of influence around its borders. Um, and we agreed to that in 1945. We agreed to a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. They were going to have essentially what became the Warsaw Bloc. That was going to be theirs. Roosevelt conceded it. Even Churchill conceded it, and they messed it up. They messed it up. Instead of producing enthusiastic Russophiles in Eastern Europe, they produced opposition. They ruled with a brutal hand, and they inspired
Right.
opposition and desires for independence. So we tried to live with something like what Putin wants, and it didn't work. It didn't work, and the, NATO is the result of Russian authoritarianism,
Did you
Russian
did
brutality.
you, did you watch the interview with Vladimir Putin? Have you seen that?
No, I didn't.
No, you didn't see it. Well, you're speaking directly to him because this is exactly the kind of stuff that he said. That's interesting. What do you think of the interview? Do you think it should have happened? I know the European Union, I believe, actually sanctioned Tucker Carlson for even going there and interviewing the man. I'm curious what you think about that. It's a little bit off topic, but you know.
I don't. I don't much like censorship. I think it's probably better for us to hear what Putin thinks of himself and his country, what he thinks he's doing. I suspect I haven't heard the interview. I suspect that Carlson was probably a little. He was perhaps not a aggressive questioner.
Well, you're sitting in the middle of the Kremlin. I think it's difficult for anybody to be particularly aggressive. But
Well,
you would be right. He pushed and he poked a little bit, but like ultimately, like it wasn't an interrogation. So you know your suspicions are correct. Uh, yeah. No. So very interesting stuff. What about I mean, I don't know. You don't have to answer this if you don't want to get canceled, but I am curious for Israel Palestine. I mean, where do you come down on that? Because that is something that is tearing apart universities, as I'm sure you are intimately familiar with. Um, how would you apply just war theory there?
well, uh, there is a long history,
Very true.
but the fact is that on October 7th, Israel was attacked in a very brutal, sadistic way. Um, and I think any country in the world attacked that way would have responded militarily,
Mm,
forcefully. Um, and that forceful response encountered uh, a war. I mean, that forceful response began a war that was essentially designed by Hamas, um,
right.
by embedding itself so deeply in the civilian population. They made it impossible to fight without killing civilians.
Mm,
The more civilians you kill, the more international outrage rises and the demands for ceasefire begin. Um, I would like to see an end of the war, a negotiated end. I don't think there can now be a successful, morally successful um, continuation of the war against in the south against Rafah. But I do believe that the Israeli response was justified, and that, as I said, any country would have responded in the same way. But I've written about what I call the asymmetry trap.
Mm,
Uh, an asymmetric war is a war fought between a high tech army and a low tech insurgency.
yeah.
And the truth of the matter is that if you think about asymmetric wars, the high tech army doesn't win. The French in Algeria, the Americans in Vietnam, the Americans in
British,
Afghanistan, the Americans in Iraq,
the
um,
Americans versus the British.
the Israelis in Lebanon.
Hmm.
The high tech army doesn't necessarily lose, but it doesn't win,
Hmm.
and that's because the insurgents, and Hamas has done this to a greater extent than any of the other insurgents. The insurgents fight from civilian cover. And then and so the high tech army ends up doing most of the killing,
Right,
and they get blamed for that. And eventually, the pressure for a ceasefire comes, and the war stops at a time when the high tech army hasn't won, and the insurgency survives to fight another time, or sometimes it survives to win, as in Vietnam.
right.
So Israel walked into the asymmetry trap, and that's the I think much of the international outrage should be focused on Hamas. Uh,
Do you see a two-state solution as still being possible? Because
yeah,
I gotta tell you, I have my doubts. I
it,
mean,
it has to be possible because it's the only it's the only solution.
well,
You can sustain a conflict without solution for a long time, but if there is to be a solution, it has to be two states.
I mean, if you talk to some of the more radicals on the other side, I think there's a solution of one state, where the other guy just blows the other guy off the face of the map. That's not my preferred solution. Do you think that's even like theoretically possible, or do you think that's a fool's errand?
Well, it's yes. Brutality is possible in human history.
Hmm.
Um, there are now Jewish zealots, um, the product of the worldwide revival of religious zealotry, which we see in Hinduism and in Buddhism and in Judaism and in Islam. So there are Jewish zealots who want the whole thing and would happily drive out Palestinians from the West Bank. And there are Islamist zealots who want the end of not only the end of Israel, but the end of any Jewish presence uh, on Arab, what they think of as Arab and Muslim land. So, yes, there are terrible people on both sides, but there are also, I hope, people who think about the well-being of their own people. And to guarantee the well-being of both peoples, you're going to need two states.
Right. Do you think? I suppose it is the only option. How we get there, I imagine, is the much more complicated problem after so much has been done. And, like, how do you rebuild trust at this point?
Both Israelis and Palestinians need outside help to achieve an agreement among themselves.
I tend to agree, actually. Um, okay, I think I got a handle on that. The next, major topic to talk about, we might end up ending with this one, is I noticed an emphasis in my research review of, the an emphasis on practical over abstract political philosophy. I'm curious what you mean by that. I feel like I know what you mean, but I want to hear from you. What does that mean?
Well, it goes along with believing in democratic politics and political activism.
Mm.
Um, I think that uh, you have to write if you're interested in being in finding a public. You have to write in an accessible way. You have to write for your fellow citizens and not for your graduate students. And that's what I've always tried to tried to do. Um, for a long time, I've been associated with a magazine called Dissent, which was founded by far leftists who were moving away from left sectarianism and looking for a, a larger public, a larger engagement in American politics. And
Mhm.
we adopted Orwell's essay on politics in the English language as a key text, because that was precisely an argument for people to talk um, to their fellow citizens and to avoid jargon, to avoid academic, the endless qualifications of an academic sentence, um, to speak directly, to speak at least some of the time in declarative sentences.
And why is that so important? I guess would be my next question.
Well, if you believe in democracy, there has to be a realm of debate, of argument. And if you want to be part of that realm, you've got to talk in ways that people will understand. Um, I also
Do you
found
think that, I'm sorry. Do you think that you are unique in this desire among academics to make yourself very accessible to the common man, or do you think that's a general desire that many academics have?
some academics have it.
It's,
Um,
it's rare.
and
Or,
I edited this magazine, Dissent, for about 20 years. And I can tell you that many of the academics who thought they were writing in our way for a political magazine and not an academic journal were actually writing in an academic language that they had not managed to escape. And I had to edit their prose.
that's
Because,
fun.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, there are quite a few academics who want a larger audience, and there are a smaller number who are capable of finding
Mhm.
a larger audience.
You mentioned Orwell for a second. This is a personal idiosyncrasy, but I've always preferred Brave New World to 1984. I'm curious. Have you read both? And I'm curious for your thoughts.
I have read both, though, probably 50 years ago.
That's pretty long. Yeah, yeah. Uh,
Um, I don't. Yeah, I don't remember which account of the horrific future I preferred, but
well, I can give you the spark notes as to the difference. So Brave New World is basically the idea that human beings will enslave themselves through being addicted to pleasure and vices of various sorts. And there might be some genetic editing, and basically we'll enslave ourselves and numb ourselves through absolute pleasure, and we'll forget about religion and meaning. And that's what it's about. People are addicted to soma. It makes pain go away. That's Brave New World. In 1984 is more there's this outside government body that is oppressing humanity through information. And I think both are good, and I think both are correct to some extent. But I will say, as a young person growing up in today's world, as much as there's Orwellian information and Orwellian language games going on, really, like on the ground, it feels a little bit like more like Brave New World to me. But I am curious for your thoughts on, I guess, those two ideas.
well, I grew up and read Orwell in a much earlier time when we were thinking about totalitarianism, about Nazism, and Stalinism, and 1984 seemed much more directly relevant to those concerns. And what was, in a way, heartening about 1984 was the idea that at least a few ordinary people pursuing ordinary pleasures, loving each other, um, were somehow a silent opposition
Hmm.
to that kind of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Orwell spoke to us because we were living in that world.
Yeah. I noticed I reread them both very recently, and one of the big similarities between the books is the idea of relativism. I mean, there's a very famous speech at the end of 1984 where he talks about how reality is whatever Big Brother says it is. And there's a similar idea in Brave New World, Pleasant, that like reality is whatever makes people happy. I'm curious because you don't seem to be, a very staunch like traditionalist. So I'm curious, what is your maybe this is outside of the realm of political philosophy, but I'm going to ask you anyway, which is what is your position on the status of morality and like capital T truth? Do you believe that it's real and it's out there and it restricts people regardless of whether they agree with it? Or are you more on the more subjectivist, let's say cultural liberal side of things?
I,
Big questions.
I believe that we live in a moral world, an objective moral world that has been created by human beings, but not yesterday, created over many, many centuries, um, sometimes through experiment, sometimes, like I think the rules of war were arrived at through the kind of trial and error, people experiencing atrocities and trying to prevent them and inventing rules. And the rules at some point become comprehensible across borders and they become conventional. But yes, I believe the moral world exists and can be described in objective ways. But that doesn't mean that it was delivered by God at Mount Sinai entire. It is a human creation, but I don't believe in the people who talk about social construction as if we construct our world every other day,
Right.
reconstruct it.
Hmm.
So,
Um, follow up there is, I mean, it's kind of the same question, which is one, would you say that if we've developed this system of rules in a pragmatic way to help us avoid things like atrocities, the obvious next question is what makes our atrocities objectively evil, or are they just, not preferable? There's a difference between humans not liking a thing and the thing being actually wrong, or maybe there's not. So I'm curious. So that's question number one, and the question that's built into it is: can anything built by humans, or that at least really be objective? Is that like even possible? Um, so I guess those are the two push questions.
well, look, think of it as a house. We live in a moral house.
Hmm.
We've built it, and it is real. It's in that sense, I'm a moral realist. The moral world is real. Um, we can argue about its foundations. As a philosopher, I have stayed in the house. I haven't gone down
Right.
to find the foundations. There are different possible ideas about what the foundations are, but the house exists.
Mm.
Um, and I think if I needed to work out, which I've never done, a kind of naturalist account, how does it what makes our moral world objectively valid is the idea that we have created it because we are vulnerable human beings, um, and because we are often aggressive and ugly in our relations with other people, and we can recognize the aggressiveness and the ugliness, and we can try to develop protections against it, which and more morality is our protection.
Mm.
Um,
And I think that works for most people. I really do. But I got a nagging fear in the back of my head, which is that all it takes for the moral system to just not apply anymore is for one guy to say, I just don't really care. I like, it's the psychopath problem or the fanatic problem. It's like all of a sudden, like, I know that our whole moral house was built on a foundation of avoiding needless suffering or avoiding atrocity. But, if you just reject that premise, which some weird people can do, all of a sudden the house falls apart and it's not restraining on people anymore.
no,
And to me, it's a little bit worrying.
it doesn't fall apart because the rest of us recognize the guy that you are describing as an enemy. And
Right, right. But this is the thing because now he's an enemy. Not, I guess this is me being a little bit postmodern, I suppose, but not in any legitimate way, because all he does is disagree with one of our premises. And if we agree that, there's no cosmic, like, God like moral order that makes the premise atrocity is bad objectively more true, then him agreeing with the last 300 years of disagreeing with the last 300 years of humanity is just like a difference of opinion, like Red Sox versus Yankees, as opposed, right? Like that's kind of scary to me, unless you think I'm misunderstanding the structure. But I've been thinking about this quite a bit.
there are people who reject our shared morality,
Hmm.
um, and we have to we deal with them. We repress them.
So
We,
arbitrary mob justice. Uh,
no, it's not arbitrary because we are defending a human world, which is not you. You said 300 years. It's many thousands of.
but yes, much. I was straw manning a little bit. I apologize. Uh, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's ultimately arbitrary either, but that's because I think it corresponds to something higher and real. But I would just say that without something higher and transcendental, I think, you know, old and popular doesn't necessarily mean true. I guess would be the very cynical comeback.
Yeah.
I don't know. Hmm.
Old and popular wasn't exactly where I was describing.
I'm sorry. Continue. I apologize.
No, I mean, I think of the way things have gotten worked out. I imagine two strangers meet in the desert, uh, 5,000 years before the Common Era, and they stare at one another, and they don't know, is this other person a threat or not? Um, and one of them makes a gesture that looks threatening, and the other backs off or attacks. And that happens again and again till somebody says, it doesn't have to work this way." And the next time it happens, they raise their hand and they say, "I come in peace." And the other guy looks at them and decides maybe they're not threatening. And there you begin to get the laws of hospitality, which ruled encounters in places like the desert for a very long time. Um, and someone who we have biblical accounts,
Mhm.
and I'm sure pre biblical accounts. A stranger who comes in peace, not threatening. You not only give him shelter, you give him a bowl of soup. Abraham runs to kill a lamb so that he can serve the stranger who has come. But that's the work of a very long time. And once it happens, we all know that there are reasons for it, and we recognize the aggressor. the aggressor who breaks the rules, who comes with a sword in hand and tries to steal our whatever. We recognize him as someone who needs to be punished, who needs to be resisted. Um,
Well,
but
I certainly hope that recognition continues.
yeah.
Um, I certainly hope so. I have one last thing to talk to you about. Maybe this is dessert, I suppose, is talking about cultural toleration quite a bit. I read a little bit about that somewhere. Hopefully that is also in your wheelhouse. And I'm a fan of toleration in the abstract, but what I would say is that I don't think that the current problem in Western civilization is a lack of toleration. I think that a lack of standards and moral unity is closer to our problem. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that type of idea.
Well, the idea of toleration isn't quite the right way of thinking about living together, because toleration implies that there is someone who tolerates and someone who is tolerated. It implies a power relationship. Um, and I would prefer to talk about cultural pluralism,
Mm,
to think about the ways in which we live, we ought to live together. But I also agree that living together implies some common commitments.
hmm
Um, and they may be, in some cases, moral commitments, they may be political commitments. Um, America is a pluralist society. It is racially, religiously, ethnically pluralistic, um,
I
and
think,
it
yeah.
is held together by um, politics, by our commitment to the Constitution, the Bill of the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. We have a civil religion with these authoritative documents, and a commitment to all of them. To that is what makes possible what I think of as a liberal democracy that can encompass multiplicity. But there does have to be that overriding commitment.
And
Um,
I mean, I totally agree. I think that you have to have, on the most fundamental level, shared values if you want to live together. I think the civil religion is helpful. I would argue that it's insufficient. I mean, Madison thought so. Constitution is only fit for a moral and religious people, wholly inadequate for any other. Because what it basically says is leave each other alone. I don't know if that's good enough to build a happy family or a country. So I guess this is my last question for you: is but so I would say number one that, and I think that the values necessary to hold together a country we don't have. But even further, from what I'm seeing, I'm experiencing a great loss in even the civil religion, a great loss of faith in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and founding ideals, irrespective of the moral and religious values that Madison said were also necessary. So I'm curious for you. I mean, big question. Do you think America can survive um, the how deep the divisions have grown? Yes or no, and if no, and how do we make things better? I guess again, easy questions. I imagine you'll solve them immediately, but I guess that's the last question for the day: is how do are we in trouble, and if so, how do we get out of it if we can?
People my age tend to look back to the good old days and worry about disasters in view.
hmm
Um,
In
I,
that case, I feel very old because that's what I think about all the time. Um,
I try to avoid
oh,
that syndrome. America has been very divided in the past. I have taken an interest in the 1840s and 50s before the Civil War, when it really looked like the country was coming apart and the divisions were very deep. Not only the the slavery and anti-slavery divisions, but the immigration divisions. The Know Nothing Party was a party that won majorities in Massachusetts and New York. It was opposed to the Catholic, the Irish immigrants, violently opposed. Um, the divisions were very, very deep, and it took a war to get us through them. Um, I hope that's not what we face now, but I do agree the divisions in America today are deep and very disturbing. Um, and at this moment, um, I shiver thinking about what might happen in November. Um, I don't want my grandchildren to live in, to grow up in a country ruled by demagogues, by authoritarian demagogues. Um, so I have a vision of America, um, which I think can be sustained if we fight for it, um, as a genuinely pluralist society, um, held together by a commitment to democracy, to a history of democratic struggles, beginning with the War of Independence. Um, I would I would want all Americans to study the history. I think education is a key to, and all the book banning campaigns and the campaigns to tell the story dishonestly. Um, all that is very dangerous. I
See, that's
think
such a beautiful answer, and I would like to end with it, but
you're not going to.
I can't do it. I can't do it. I mean, I'm sure there's examples of books being banned that shouldn't be banned, but I'm curious if you're aware that some of those books were like genuinely pornographic. Um, are you familiar? I wrote for a Florida news outlet for like a year and a half, so I got pretty in deep, and I've actually seen the books, at least some of them.
Yeah, no, I would not. I would not.
Yeah.
I would not deliver pornographic reading matter to second graders or fifth graders or even eighth graders.
And I also think it's a little. I actually disagree with some of the book bans. There are some book bans like the Clear Blue Eye or some, which involves like a pretty graphic rape scene. But it's like it's a it's a classic. They decided to ban it, and it's not something I would do. But if we were talking about local communitarianism and that sort of thing, and I'm just like, well, the parents of a school in the school board deciding what they want their standards to be and what they want their children exposed to, it seems like they're within their rights to do that, I suppose. But maybe that's just the localist communitarian in me. I'm curious for
Yes,
your thought there.
sometimes, as you said before, we need strong national
It's true.
words.
It's very true.
So
Striking that balance is the trick, hey?
racism was a localist ideology, and it needed
Right.
to be
Right.
overcome by national intervention. So
Yeah. Very true. I like to think that parents being stuffy about graphic scenes in books isn't exactly the same thing as segregated water fountains, but I definitely agree that striking that balance between unified national identity and values and federalism and local authority is always the great magic trick. Um,
yes,
I
yes.
think I think that's a great place to end though.
Okay.
Professor Michael Walzer, thank you so much for coming and talk to me. Is there anything you want to tell the audience about? Any more books that you're planning on popping out? Anything you want to say?
I am not at the moment writing a book.
Well, if you do write anything, I'll be sure to pick it up. Thank you so much for coming and talk to me. We might be doing it again. We'll see. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for a great show.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Ba, ba, ba. And actually, that's going to do it for our show overall. We are done. There was a ton of interesting news. Biden's DOJ said that he was unfit to sheriff trial. Tucker interviewed Putin. Very interesting stuff. Unfortunately, or rather, fortunately, I don't have to talk about topical politics. I just got to do one of my favorite things to do, which is talk political philosophy. So, thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to tune in next week for more of the same. And Sunday night at the same time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, for the Penguin Update, where I'm talking with people who disagree with me much more than Professor Walzer did. As always, thank you all for watching. Tune in next time. See y'all next time.